The October of 1945 arrived at a displaced persons camp in the British occupation zone near Lübeck, with the kind of weather that made northern Germany particularly grim. Cold rain that fell steadily from low gray clouds, mud that turned pathways into channels of thick clay, wind that carried the smell of Baltic sea salt mixed with the coal smoke from inadequate heating systems struggling to warm overcrowded buildings. The camp housed approximately 3,000 German civilians displaced by the war's final chaos. Families fleeing the Soviet advance from eastern territories, refugees from bombed cities, women and children whose men had died or disappeared. The human wreckage of total war's collapse seeking temporary shelter until something resembling normal life could be reconstructed from the ruins of Nazi Germany's defeat. Among these 3,000 were children, hundreds of them, ranging from infants to teenagers, many orphaned, most traumatized, all bearing the physical and psychological marks of having lived through the most destructive conflict in human history. They suffered from malnutrition that made their bodies vulnerable to diseases that adequate food would have prevented, from untreated medical conditions that had festered during months or years when German medical systems collapsed, from the accumulated damage of bombing and displacement and loss that manifested in both physical illness and psychological distress. The British military authorities administering the camp provided what they could: food rations that were adequate if not generous, shelter that kept out most of the weather, medical care through field hospitals staffed by British Army doctors and nurses who treated German civilians because military occupation created obligations that transcended the resentments that 6 years of war had generated. The medical facilities at the camp consisted of a converted warehouse fitted with rows of cots, basic surgical equipment, supplies of medications that chronic shortages made precious, and staff that worked shifts covering 24 hours because emergencies did not respect schedules. The senior medical officer, a Major Thomas Ashworth, who had spent 4 years treating battlefield casualties from North Africa through Normandy to Germany itself, understood something about triage and loss, about making decisions regarding who could be saved and who was beyond help, about maintaining professional detachment in situations where emotional involvement would make the work impossible. His instructions to his staff were clear: treat everyone who could be helped, prioritize cases based on medical need rather than nationality or politics, maintain professional standards regardless of how difficult the circumstances made that maintenance, and remember that these were patients rather than enemies, people deserving of care rather than symbols requiring ideological classification. Among the patients who arrived at the medical facility on a cold morning in mid-October was a German girl named Anna Hoffmann, 12 years old, accompanied by her mother who carried her because the girl could no longer walk. Anna had been ill for several days, initially with symptoms that resembled influenza, fever, fatigue, body aches that her mother attributed to the general weakness that malnutrition caused. But the illness had progressed rapidly, the fever spiking higher, consciousness becoming intermittent, the girl's body showing signs of systemic infection that suggested something more serious than simple flu. Her mother, a widow whose husband had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1943, who had fled from Silesia ahead of the Soviet advance with her 2 daughters, who had already lost her younger child to dysentery during the chaotic flight westward, brought Anna to the British medical facility with desperation that transcended any hesitation about seeking help from occupation forces. The British nurse who received them, a woman named Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, who had trained at Guy's Hospital in London before the war and had spent 3 years in military medical service, assessed Anna quickly with the practiced efficiency that emergency care demanded. The girl was critically ill, burning with fever that indicated severe infection, barely conscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. Mitchell called for a doctor immediately, helped Anna's mother carry the girl to one of the cots, began the initial assessment that would determine what treatment was possible and whether it would be sufficient. Major Ashworth examined Anna within minutes, his hands moving with professional precision through the diagnostic procedures that his training had made automatic, checking pulse and respiration, examining throat and lymph nodes, palpating abdomen for signs of acute pathology. His expression remained neutral, the careful blankness that doctors learn to maintain when delivering difficult information. But Mitchell, working beside him, recognized the subtle tension that indicated serious concern. Ashworth spoke quietly in English that Anna's mother could not understand. Bacterial meningitis, Advanced. We can try antibiotics, but at this stage, he left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear to any medical professional. The infection had progressed too far. The girl's body was already shutting down. Treatment would be attempted because medical ethics demanded it, but success was unlikely. They began treatment immediately. Antibiotics administered through injection, fluids to combat dehydration, medications to reduce the fever that was causing seizures. Anna was placed in the isolation section where contagious cases were quarantined. Her mother permitted to remain beside her despite the infection risk because separating dying children from their parents violated humanitarian standards that British medical practice maintained even in field conditions. The treatment was everything that medical science in 1945 could provide, but antibiotics that might have saved Anna, if administered earlier, were fighting an infection that had already caused damage beyond repair. By afternoon, it was clear that the girl was dying, her consciousness fading despite medications, her breathing becoming more labored, her body shutting down in the cascade of organ failure that severe sepsis caused. Major Ashworth made the decision that doctors sometimes had to make: shift from curative treatment to palliative care, from attempting to save life to ensuring that death came as comfortably as possible. He explained this to Anna's mother through a German-speaking interpreter, told her that they would keep her daughter comfortable, that pain would be managed, that she would not be alone. The mother, who had already lost one daughter and was now losing another, whose entire world had collapsed around her during years of war and displacement, simply nodded. She had no tears left. She just held her daughter's hand and waited for the end. But the isolation ward where Anna lay dying presented a problem. The mother could not remain there continuously. Infection control protocols required limited exposure, and she needed to eat and rest even as her daughter's life ebbed away. She would have to leave periodically, would have to entrust her dying child to the care of British medical staff who were enemies by nationality, even if they were caregivers by profession. The thought of Anna dying alone, of her final moments being witnessed by strangers rather than family, created distress that transcended the physical. It meant dying without connection, without the human presence that made death bearable rather than simply biological cessation. Lieutenant Mitchell, observing this mother's grief and understanding what it meant to watch a child die among foreigners in a displaced persons camp that was home to none and familiar to all, made a decision that no medical manual prescribed and no regulation required. She told Anna's mother, through the interpreter, that the girl would not die alone, that if her mother needed to leave, British medical staff would sit with Anna, would hold her hand, would ensure that her final moments included human presence and comfort, even if that presence came from people who spoke different language and represented different nation. The symbolic object that defined this moment was neither medical equipment nor medicine, but something more fundamental: the hand itself, that universal gesture of human connection, the physical touch that communicated presence and care when words failed or language barriers made verbal communication impossible. The act of holding a dying child's hand was medically unnecessary, contributed nothing to treatment outcomes, served no practical purpose in the efficient management of medical resources. But it served a human purpose that transcended medical efficiency. It acknowledged that dying mattered, that how people experienced their final moments had value independent of whether those moments could be extended, that the presence of another human being offering comfort through simple touch was dignity that even dying children in displaced persons camps deserved. Over the next 18 hours, as Anna's condition deteriorated and her mother came and went in the pattern that exhaustion and practical necessity demanded, British medical staff maintained the promise that Lieutenant Mitchell had made. When Anna's mother left to eat or rest, a British nurse or orderly would sit beside the girl's cot, would hold her hand, would speak softly in English that she could not understand but that provided the auditory presence that indicated someone was there. The staff rotated through this duty. Lieutenant Mitchell, a corporal named James Wright, who had worked as a hospital orderly in civilian life, other nurses and medics who took shifts ensuring that Anna was never alone, that even as consciousness faded and the girl sank deeper into the coma that preceded death, human touch remained constant. The other patients in the medical facility, German civilians recovering from various illnesses and injuries, observed this vigil with reactions that mixed surprise with something deeper. They had been taught by Nazi propaganda that British people were cold and calculating, that democratic societies lacked the spiritual depth that gave meaning to suffering, that enemies showed mercy only when it served strategic interests. But British medical staff sitting beside a dying German girl, holding her hand, ensuring she did not die alone despite having no obligation beyond professional care, contradicted these teachings in ways that were difficult to reconcile with ideological frameworks that Nazi education had instilled. One patient, an elderly man recovering from pneumonia, who had been a schoolteacher before the war, spoke quietly to another patient about what he was witnessing. "They don't have to do this. The girl is dying regardless of whether anyone holds her hand, but they do it anyway, as though her final moments matter, as though a German child's death deserves the same dignity they would provide to their own children." What kind of enemies are these? The question was rhetorical but profound. It captured the cognitive dissonance of observing enemy soldiers providing care that went beyond medical necessity to address human need, that treated dying as an event requiring ritual and presence rather than simply biological process to be managed efficiently. The Nazi regime had taught that strength came from hardness, that sentiment was weakness, that efficient administration of necessary tasks was all that duty required. But British medical staff holding a dying child's hand demonstrated different values. That strength included the capacity for compassion. That duty encompassed obligations that transcended efficient task completion, that how people treated the dying revealed character that no military victory could demonstrate. Anna Hoffman died in the early hours of October 16, 1945, with her mother beside her and Lieutenant Mitchell holding her other hand, the girl's breathing becoming slower and shallower until it simply stopped. The transition from life to death marked by stillness rather than struggle. Mitchell maintained her professional composure, checked for pulse that was no longer present, noted the time of death in the medical records that documented each case regardless of outcome. But her expression showed something beyond professional detachment. The accumulated weight of too many deaths witnessed, too many children who had died from diseases that adequate nutrition and timely treatment would have prevented, too many families destroyed by war that military victory could not undo. Anna's mother, holding her daughter's body, began the grieving that protocol would permit only briefly before practical necessities demanded attention. The body would need to be prepared for burial. Space in the medical facility would need to be cleared for the next patient. The machinery of managing 3,000 displaced persons would continue functioning regardless of individual loss. But in that moment, before efficiency reasserted itself, Mitchell simply remained beside the mother and dead child, maintaining human presence that acknowledged that this death mattered, that this mother's loss deserved recognition even if the system could not stop to fully honor it. The word spread through the camp quickly, not through official channels, but through the informal networks that connected displaced persons who had little besides each other and the stories they shared. British medical staff had held a dying German girl's hand, had ensured she did not die alone, had provided comfort that went beyond medical obligation to address human need. The story gained details as it spread, some accurate, some embellished, all centered on the essential fact that enemy soldiers had treated a German child's death as an event requiring compassion rather than simply task requiring efficient completion. The transformation this incident worked on camp residents was subtle but real. They did not suddenly embrace British occupation or abandon German identity, or develop gratitude that their education had taught them not to feel toward victorious enemies. But they did absorb evidence that contradicted Nazi propaganda about British character and democratic values. If British medical staff would sit beside a dying German child, would hold her hand, would ensure she experienced human presence in her final moments, then perhaps the ideology that characterized British people as cold and calculating was wrong. If enemy soldiers showed compassion toward defeated civilians' children, then perhaps defeat had not placed Germans beyond the reach of human decency. Perhaps occupation by democratic powers was different from what Nazi ideology had predicted. Perhaps the rules governing behavior toward enemies operated from premises that Nazi teaching had never adequately explained. The British medical staff, who had participated in Anna's vigil, processed the experience according to their own values and understanding. Some viewed it simply as professional duty. Patients deserved comfort, dying children deserved presence. Holding a hand was a minimal gesture that cost nothing and provided something that mattered. Others understood it in more explicitly moral terms, that how a society treated the most vulnerable people under its power revealed character that political systems and military strength could not demonstrate, that showing compassion toward enemy children was not weakness, but expression of values that defined British culture and that occupation forces were obligated to maintain even when circumstances made maintenance difficult. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, writing in her journal that night after Anna's death, tried to articulate what the experience had meant. Held a German girl's hand as she died today. 12 years old, could have been any of the children I knew in London before the war. Her mother had already lost one daughter, was losing another, had nothing left except the knowledge that her child did not die alone. I don't know if it mattered to the girl, she was unconscious by the end, but it mattered to the mother. And it mattered to us, the staff, because we needed to know that we were still the kind of people who would sit with dying children rather than simply documenting their deaths and moving to the next patient. The war ended 6 months ago, but we're still fighting. Not against enemies, but against the brutality that war creates, against the tendency to see people as categories rather than individuals, against the efficiency that forgets that every death matters to someone, even if it doesn't matter to the system. The journal entry captured something essential about what motivated British medical staff to provide care that transcended strict professional obligation. The recognition that maintaining humanity in dehumanizing circumstances required conscious choice, that treating patients as people rather than cases was a decision that needed to be renewed continuously, that the values Britain claimed to represent had to be demonstrated through daily actions rather than simply proclaimed through political rhetoric. The camp did not fall silent in literal sense. 3,000 people continuing their daily lives created constant noise, the sound of survival and adaptation, and the slow work of rebuilding from ruins. But something shifted in how German civilians in that camp understood their British occupiers. The silence was internal, the pause that came from processing information that contradicted assumptions, from confronting evidence that the enemies they had been taught to fear and hate were capable of compassion toward German children, from recognizing that the ideology they had served had been wrong about fundamental things, including whether democratic societies valued human dignity enough to extend it even to the children of defeated enemies. Anna Hoffman was buried in a cemetery near the camp, one grave among thousands that marked the human cost of war's final chaos and occupation's difficult aftermath. Her mother attended the burial, accompanied by Lieutenant Mitchell, who had requested permission to be present because, as she explained to Major Ashworth, I held her hand when she died. The least I can do is be there when she's buried. The gesture was small, probably meaningless to all except the mother and the few medical staff who attended, but it represented something about British military culture that Nazi ideology had never adequately explained. That obligations created by caring for patients extended beyond medical treatment to encompass the rituals that gave death meaning. That professional relationships created human connections that deserved honoring even when the patient came from enemy nation and the caregiver came from occupying power. In the years that followed, as Germany was rebuilt and the occupation evolved from military administration to civilian governance, the story of British medical staff holding a dying German girl's hand became one of thousands of similar stories that circulated among Germans processing their experience of Allied occupation. The story was not dramatic or heroic. No lives were saved, no grand gestures were made, simply a child dying with human presence and comfort that British medical staff provided because they believed that how people experienced death mattered regardless of nationality or political allegiance. But the story persisted because it captured something about the difference between what Nazi propaganda had predicted and what many Germans actually experienced under Allied occupation. That the enemies they had been taught were barbarous and cruel were capable of showing compassion to German children. That democratic values about human dignity were not just political rhetoric, but commitments that influenced daily behavior even toward the children of defeated enemies. That the silence that spread through a displaced persons camp when British medics held a dying girl's hand was recognition that perhaps everything they had been taught about enemies and allies, about strength and weakness, about who deserved compassion and who deserved only efficient administration, had been wrong in ways that would take years to fully understand and decades to properly acknowledge.